Yet the Great War also instilled in many a longing to reclaim the goodness, beauty, and cultural continuity that had been so violently disrupted. The Inklings came together because they shared that longing, and it was the Inklings who gave that longing its most enduring artistic form and substance. Far from breaking with tradition, they understood the Great War and its aftermath in light of tradition, believing, as did their literary and spiritual ancestors, that ours is a fallen world, yet not a forsaken one.
Well, this great quote comes from a fantastic book on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien called The Fellowship by the Zaleskis, and we've promoted it several times in this series. But if you're hearing The Fellowship, you know we're back to our series on J.R.R. Tolkien, and we're launching out into the second episode. Last time we talked about his early life, and what occurred to me there and what we mentioned is how important the early life of Tolkien and the early life of Lewis were in shaping them to come. In fact, I think about several of the biographers with C.S. Lewis who said if you can understand his first 15 years, you can
Uh-huh.
understand his whole life. Do you think the same is true or different for Tolkien?
Well, I think it's largely the same for Tolkien. I think we see the seeds of what he became, and particularly the seeds of his literary achievements, albeit in very small form, but you see them early in his life.
Well, I've been fascinated by the early lives of these authors because it does give you so many glimpses into what they're writing. And so, as we covered last time, when you understand his education, you start to understand his interests. When you understand his family background, you start to understand the way he writes out certain themes in The Lord of the Rings. And today we're going to cover the greatest impact, I think, both on Lewis and Tolkien outside of their upbringing, which is the Great War. And so we'll start today. He's graduated from King Edward's School, but our scene opens today in 1913 at King Edward's School. And in December of that year, they had an annual tradition at King Edward's School where all the alumni that were available would come back for a school alumni rugby game. So this is kind of like the equivalent of your alums come back and play basketball against your starting five, and everybody gets to watch. Except in true King Edward style, not only did they play rugby against each other, they had debates, they had language contests, all the things that you would expect from these kids at King Edward's School. And so Tolkien, who was now 2 years into college at Oxford, was back, and so were the rest of the TCBS. These four friends that he's made. Two, Wiseman and Gilson, are at Cambridge, and two, Tolkien and Smith, are at Oxford. And that night, there's dinner, and they're talking, and they're telling stories, and they're reuniting and remembering all the great memories they had. In the meantime, Tolkien is doing wonderfully at Oxford. If you watch the movie Tolkien, which we've referenced many times, he gets off to a bit of a rough start trying to
Right.
figure out what he wants to do. But by the time he gets off of classics, which is almost the default major that you would study at a time like this, coming out of a school at King Edward's, and into English, especially ancient English, Middle English literature, he begins to thrive. He's won Exeter College's Skeet Prize for English at this point, and his imagination for Old English and myths and ancient sagas is completely ablaze, as it will be for the rest of his life. In hindsight, of course, the looming event here is World War One. It would be just about 6 months later in June of 1914 that Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, which is typically thought of as the beginning, the domino that begins World War One. Later in that year, in August, England declares war on Germany. If you remember, World War One is such a convoluted web
Hmm.
of alliances and treaties and vows of protection that the major powers that end up fighting in World War One actually don't have any stake in the original beef that causes World War
Right.
One. It's the fact that they're allied to protect certain people who are going to protect certain people who are going to fight certain other people. And so by the time you get to the end of 1914, it's become a world war after months of standoffs and failed negotiations. And if you think back to World War One, it really is almost otherworldly how horrible this war was. They call it the Great War. It was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. Of course, again, in hindsight, we know that it wasn't. But just the sheer scale of the tragedy of World War One is almost impossible to wrap your mind around. I mean, Britain alone had over 880,000 casualties. I mean, just think, Britain is not a huge country. That's 1 in 8 of the people who were deployed were killed in World War One. The losses in World War One were actually worse among the upper classes. So the boys
Right.
that went to school with Tolkien, Eton, a lot of these places, Cambridge and Oxford, there of the people who were deployed into the war, 1 in 5 were killed. And so this scene that we open with at King Edward's School, on that field where they're playing rugby, dozens of those boys will end up dying in World War
Hmm.
One. And as we know from our last episode, 2 of the 4 in the TCBS will end up dying in World War One. They were all shipped out together, and when they found that they were going to leave for the war, there was this real romantic notion at this point. World War One, one of the things that caused it to be such a horrible war was people went into it with the mindset that it was going to be like the last series of wars in the end of the 19th century, where you had a
Hmm.
lot of fighting, but not necessarily a lot of dying.
Right.
Technological advances, kind of the phenomenon of fighting the last war, means that World War One was a slaughter in ways that nobody expected. And because of that, you had Tolkien and his friends volunteering to go fight in the war. It was a noble thing to do. They had kind of a righteous cause mentality. And when they realized that all 4 of them were going to be deployed into action, they had what they thought might be the last meeting called the Council of London. And they come back, they spend the weekend together. It's a real turning point for Tolkien. His relationship with the TCBS had waned a bit. And what's really interesting for our story is when they get back together, it rekindles all of these deep loves and motives that Tolkien had for doing his art and for writing and for thinking about
Hmm.
beauty and goodness and truth. In fact, he would write later to Jeffrey Smith that it helped me find my voice for all kinds of pent up things and a tremendous opening up of everything. But this wouldn't be the last meeting of the TCBS. Even though they were all in battle, the last meeting of the TCBS would be in September of 1915 when these boys were together for a final time. In September, they had gone on a little trip to Samuel Johnson's birthplace, great British, probably the greatest British man of letters who ever lived, Samuel
Right.
Johnson. And John Garth, who's written extensively on Tolkien, his book, Tolkien and the Great War, is my first read on Tolkien. If you're going to read anything, read that book. But he discovered actually in the visitor log of Samuel Johnson's house, which is now a museum, he found the
Hmm.
signatures from this weekend in 1915 of Robert Gilson and Jeffrey Smith. And we know from their letters that the other 2 were there as well. And after they signed their names, there's a picture of this on John Garth's website. They wrote TCBS after their names, which just shows you how much they identified, how much they cared about this group. And that kind of hauntingly is the last time that the 4 of them will ever be together.
Yes, and it's not long after that Tolkien was shipped off to France in June of 1916. He managed, I noticed in your notes, and I didn't pick this up in my reading, that he managed to graduate from Oxford before he went. Unlike most of them, they just went from school. But I want to say he was very lucky. It's not going to sound like he was lucky, but he actually was. He got married in March of 1916 to Edith Bratt, his love since for many years, and they finally are married. And then he left in June and joined the Lancashire Fusiliers, and he was part of Cole. And when I say he was lucky, he's going to end up catching trench fever. It's a it's a flea-borne disease that wasn't really always fatal, but it was very serious. It took months to recover. But his first battle was one of the bloodiest battles of World War One. It was the Battle of the Somme.
Yeah, it's almost amazing to think about what he lived through. The most harrowing battle of World War One, which is the most harrowing war in a lot of ways that you can think about. Tolkien was there. He was on the front lines. He was in combat. even though he's not in combat for very long, he was in the teeth of the war at the Battle of the Somme. This is the bloodiest single day of war in British history to that point. 20,000 soldiers died, 40,000 were wounded. Robert Gilson actually was killed in the first day,
Hmm.
first few hours of the Battle of the Somme. Winston Churchill, interestingly enough, it's funny to think about what else is going on here. Churchill, who's been kind of he had to fall on his sword and leave the government, decides in typical Churchill fashion to go out to the front lines, and he takes back
Right.
over as a lieutenant colonel in an active war zone. And he writes later about it that it was a welter of slaughter, just as brutal as you can imagine. And Tolkien is in the midst of this. And as we'll see later in the series, this experience in the worst of what war has to offer would constantly be in the back of Tolkien's mind as he's portraying battles and wars, casualties later in his own writing. I mean, he really had lived it. This is not kind of Monday morning quarterbacking. He was in the worst part of the worst war that the world had ever known, and it changed him. It colored him for the rest of his life.
It really did. And, it's hard for us now, as bad as war is, when we hear casualty counts now, they're nothing like World War One. And I just want to remind you that what made World War One so bloody was they were using tactics from the last century, the 1800s. And that's where they would get up out of their trenches, they would stand in a row, and they would all march toward the enemy. So tactics from the 1800s, but weapons from the 1900s. When you had two groups marching toward each other, and all you had were muskets, people were going to get killed, but not in these numbers. These were people marching in lines against machine guns, and the slaughter was horrendous. And so, for us, it's even hard to imagine, even in the wars that we have now, we have 21st century weapons, but we also have 21st century tactics. And I think that's part of what made it so bloody. And so he saw things that had to be unbelievable. And you're right, it did change him, but he had a stroke of good luck and he didn't realize it in getting the trench fever because he had to be sent back to England for convalescence.
Yeah, this turns out to be a very fortunate thing for Tolkien. In the same way that Lewis is injured, not injured enough to affect him for the rest of his life, but injured enough to get him out of the war. The same thing happens with Tolkien. You mentioned trench fever. This is kind of the pandemic of World War One. You have 800,000 cases of trench fever among the British troops. But it's not something that killed very many British troops, but it was something that sidelined them for months at a time. I mean, sometimes 3 months. Tolkien was sick for more than 6 months. And what happened in Tolkien's case was he kept, right, every moment he thought he was getting better, he would get sick again. And so they kept delaying his return to the war until he actually never goes back to the war. And so if you look at it in hindsight, this difficulty, I mean, it would be very difficult to be that sick for 6 months, probably saved his life. His division that he's a part of sees action several more times. Many of them are killed. It's just an odds game at that point as to whether or not
Hmm.
Tolkien himself would have been killed. But because he's convalescing, he is able to avoid being killed in war. And on the flip side, he's laying in bed thinking about all the things that have been fired in his imagination from the war. And so a lot of people point to the fall of Gondolin, which is outside of the Lord of the Rings, but in the whole mythology of the Lord of the Rings, as a direct and early uh, attempt on Tolkien's part to start writing about this universe. So the fall of Gondolin is evil prevailing and bringing down the great city of the age, just like it would have felt like to be in World War One against this great enemy. One of the really interesting things that happened, though, is as he's writing this, he's also in a hospital where there's a physician named Leonard Gamgee, who is a descendant of a really famous doctor in England at the time named Samson Gamgee, who will end up giving his name to Samwise Gamgee later in The Lord of the Rings.
There are so many things like that, Cole, that you look from not just his experiences, but also his historical reading. from the, he read widely in Welsh and Finnish and Icelandic. What's interesting to me, Cole, is he was interested primarily in languages and words. And that, of course, led him into reading Welsh and Finnish literature. And when you read them, you tend to read the classics, the great myths that underpin those civilizations. And so his love of language led him into these myths. And it's amazing how many things he pulled out of there. He didn't just steal place names or things, he took ideas and blended them together. You know what's interesting to me, you and I had talked about this a little bit, but of all the reading that he did of these great myths, the Norse sagas, the Finnish sagas, and the Welsh myths, England, I guess because they were conquered early on with the Normans, perhaps, doesn't really have a rich mythological tradition like some of these countries.
Yeah, this is something that comes to Tolkien's attention early on because he's enamored with the other mythological traditions. In England, you have Beowulf, which is kind of a backdrop, but then again, Beowulf is not totally English. You have King Arthur, but Tolkien had some interesting thoughts on King Arthur. One, he thought it was too French. You had too many French writers co-opting King Arthur. The great writers in the Arthuriad are French. And then secondly, he thought King Arthur was too overtly preachy. It's too overtly Christian, and chivalry is too overtly moral to be a great mythology.
No, that's a good point. I just want to interject here, Cole, that we are both Anglophiles. I mean, we both love English history, of course, Churchill and what he did in World War II. But I will tell you that I personally am not a Francophile. I am not a big fan of French history, and particularly not the French language. And so, lest you think that it's just my cynical bias, I want to tell you that Tolkien also was not a fan of the French language. He called it was full, he said, of polysyllabic barbarities. So I just want to make that point that Tolkien was not a fan of the French language, and I'm going to follow his lead.
That totally ruined King Arthur as a national mythology for him. Too much French influence. He did have a sense though that England needed a mythology, that actually the
Hmm.
culture itself was so grand and accomplished and historically there were so many interesting things about the spirit of the English that it needed a mythology. And this is the backdrop for what Tolkien is doing in The Lord of the Rings. And even self-consciously, he's saying things like he'd like to create a myth for England. And what we mean by that is really one of the fascinating overlaps between Tolkien's own life and The Lord of the Rings that we've been looking at. So in The Lord of the Rings, what do we mean by a mythology for England? And sometimes it's easy to think mythology, but actually do allegory. Allegory is where every
Hmm.
character lines up with something in the past, and you're kind of reinterpreting the past. So the great example of this is the Wizard of Oz. The way people interpret the Wizard of Oz, the gold standard, the lion is William Jennings Bryan. You can assign all these characters, and you're
Right.
actually talking about something that happened historically. That's not what Tolkien is doing, no matter where you think maybe the influence might be. So, is the ring nuclear weapons, looking back on World
Right.
War II, and is Sauron Hitler, and Saruman is Mussolini or somebody else, and everything
Hmm.
lines up. That's actually not what Tolkien is doing in The Lord of the Rings. Instead, what he's doing is he's trying to capture the spirit of the people. And the way he does this is he actually creates a moral universe that is much deeper and fuller than what you do when you're creating an allegory. So the struggle over good and evil and the tension between good and evil in the universe, the courage of ordinary people, the struggle of life and the battle that it takes, these things are ever present in the Lord of the Rings and in the Hobbit and in the Silmarillion. Joseph LeConte, who has written a great book called A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and the Great War, he points out that what Tolkien is really trying to do is capture the spirit of the English. What does it mean deep down to be British? And one of the things that always sticks with Tolkien is he's had this experience of going to war with all of these young men, many of whom are
Hmm.
not from London or Eton or King Edward's, many of whom are from small towns and villages across England who are courageous, doing their duty, treasuring a sense of home. And of course, you see that all over the Lord of the Rings, but most of all, you see it in the Hobbits, in the Shire. The Shire is England as it was. The homely feeling of England is what Tolkien has captured there. And LeConte quotes from Churchill's World Crisis to talk about this spirit of the English. In fact, what you could say is Churchill, actually, in his own way, he's not doing it in fantasy, he's doing it in history, is also
Hmm.
trying to capture the spirit of the English. He's doing it for political aims, but Churchill was somebody who embodied the spirit of what it means to be British. And
Right.
in The World Crisis, which is his memoir on the First World War, he says, unconquerable except by death, they set up a monument of native virtue which will command the wonder, the reverence, and the gratitude of our island people as long as we endure as a nation among men. This is similar to what Tolkien is trying to do in The Lord of the Rings. He's trying to
Hmm.
express what's really true through this fantastical story.
Yes, I remember in reading one of Tolkien's quotes when talking about the war. He was, of course, an officer, but he said he didn't care as much for the officers as he did for the enlisted men. They didn't have that much contact with them, but each of the officers would have what was called a batman, a servant, basically an enlisted person who, shined their boots and did some things like that. He said that through that experience, getting to know these men, he came to really appreciate the essential goodness of the English people. And he saw that more in the enlisted men than he did in the aristocracy than in the thing. And you were right on, Cole. You see that in the Lord of the Rings. It's always been funny to me that the heroes, they're great players in the Lord of the Rings. The great knights and the elvish kings, and you see those players, but the heroes of this story are the simple hobbits. And I
Hmm.
think that is a reflection of what he saw, what made England really great.
Right. Yeah, so sometimes you hear the claim that The Lord of the Rings is too simplistic. It's too simple a moral universe. It's too black and white. It's not realistic enough. This is a trend in modern literature. In fact, this is one of the things that made me want to go back and do Tolkien and Lewis is in our entertainment today, all entertainment has some kind of message. We have particularly preachy entertainment today, whether
Hmm.
it's, things about the sexual revolution or different kind of cultural values that we have as Americans. It's very overt, it's very preachy. It's why it's so tiresome, to watch a lot of the new movies and TV shows that come out. But the critique is basically, art needs to imitate real life. And so what
Hmm.
we've done in our art in the 21st century is we've come up with anti-heroes. So we've kind of the pendulum has swung away from the heroic. You can see this in the way that hero movies are made, like Marvel movies and things like that. Nobody is really that bad. They're either a victim, had something
Hmm.
bad happen to them as a child, forces beyond their control have shaped them into this sympathetic evil figure. Nothing is really that evil. And then on the flip side, nobody's really that good either, because if you have a hero, they've also got to have a dark side. They've got to have a
Right,
secret that they're hiding. So this is deconstruction through the lens of entertainment, which is, nothing is what it is on its surface. It is if you can find out what it is by dissecting the motives and the things behind it and the
right,
perspectives and things like that. Tolkien does not share this postmodern perspective, and so
right.
from that standpoint, it does seem like a simplistic moral universe. But I would argue so does the moral universe of the Bible in a lot of ways. There is
Hmm.
clear good and clear evil, and they are not deadlocked in a struggle that nobody knows how it will end up. Good is going to
Right.
win out,
Right.
and there will be evil, purely evil forces in the world. And this is present in Tolkien's work. I mean, from the very beginning, not in the Lord of the Rings, but in the Silmarillion, you get the creation myth as Tolkien tells it. And it's very similar to the way that Lewis talks about this in The Magician's Nephew. You have the god figure who in Tolkien's universe is called Iluvatar, who is creating the world by singing. He's singing this song that brings the world into being. And he has this band of lower beings called the Ainur, which we might think of as angels or demigods of some kind.
Hmm.
And as he's singing, all of a sudden, this discordant melody starts to be woven into the singing. Instead of harmony, you're hearing some something that's off. And it turns out that the most powerful of these is named Morgoth or Melkor, and he has corrupted the singing through his rebellion. There's something out of step, across the grain, if you will, of his creation. And this very powerful but rebellious and evil force is going to wage war on the creation itself. And so in the first age, in the second age, you essentially have these battles with Morgoth, who has taken over and subverted the world. And you're going to get a coalition of elves and the Valar, who are also kind of like angels, who come and defeat Morgoth. And this is the story of the early parts of the Silmarillion. He's
Hmm.
going to be defeated and bound. This is where you get the Cimmerils, which is where you get the Silmarillion from. And it's the backdrop of the Lord of the Rings. And one of the things that's interesting about the Lord of the Rings, and a lot of fantasy is this way, is what you're reading about in the Lord of the Rings is reflecting on a previous time when people were stronger, evil was
Right.
worse, magic was stronger. You have these kind of days of old. In fact, Harry Potter's this way. You read Harry
Right.
Potter, and the battle between Voldemort and Harry and his friends at Hogwarts is nothing compared to the Great War that happened before. And
Right.
that even is nothing compared to what happened before that, Slytherin and all the heads of the household. So you get this kind of legendarium in the background that's even realer and more intense than what you're reading about. Lord of the Rings is this way, and the backdrop is this primordial good and evil expressed through Morgoth.
That's exactly right. You can see it. He's a Christian, of course, and he's writing this fiction, but he's trying to create a world, a moral universe. And we as Christians, when you told that story about singing the universe into existence and the discordant tone, I mean, it could be the biblical creation story with Satan. It's not an allegory, but it carries those ideas. As I read about the Inklings and TCBS, though those people understood, Tolkien and his compatriots understood the world as being a fallen world, but still inhabited by grace. A very
Hmm.
Christian way of looking at the world. The world does have evil in it, and yet there is grace, and there's overpowering grace. And so they're writing in this really culturally depressed time. I mean, post World War I, in World War II, right after World War II, that whole era was very depressing for society. There was not much hope in the goodness of humanity. It had been really beaten out of people by two world wars. And here they come with this project of using story and myth to restore a moral goodness to this universe that they're creating. They had a project, I think, Cole, that was far bigger than writing fiction. It was a project to reshape the imagination of their entire generation. I mean, would you agree that they were about bigger things than we think they were about?
Well, that's definitely true. They really believe, just like the TCBS did in their own youthful, we call it naivety or
Hmm.
idealism. The Inklings too were doing this. They had undertaken a project of showing people what's really true about the world, despite what it might seem like. And this is where you get
Right.
some really interesting comments from C.S. Lewis in his review of The Lord of the Rings. And so
Mm.
you hear a lot that Lewis, had some things, had some criticism for Lord of the Rings. Tolkien had some criticism for the Chronicles of Narnia. I think this is some friendly ribbing. Lewis actually was very, very pleased with the Lord of the Rings, and in his reviews of the books, he says some really interesting things about myth and actually about what Tolkien was trying to do with myth. And in fact, what you've pointed out, what the Inklings were trying to do. He says at one point, what shows we are reading myth and not allegory is that there are no pointers to a specific theological or political or psychological application. A myth points for each reader to the realm he lives in most. It is a master key. Use it on what door you like. And there are other themes in the fellowship equally serious. So, what he's saying is you read The Lord of the Rings and you see things differently because of reading it. It's a master
Right.
key that unlocks your experience. It's a way of telling you what your world is like through reading about this other world. He says a little bit later in the review, he says the value of the myth is that it takes all the things we know and restores them to the rich significance that has been hidden by the veil of familiarity. I think this is the key thing about myth is it takes what we're so familiar with, what we're accustomed to, and it re-surprises us by the reality of it. He goes on to say, as
Hmm.
long as the story, we've got this story in our minds, and as long as the story lingers, the real things that we experience are more themselves. This book applies the treatment not only to bread or apples, but to good and evil, to our endless perils, to our anguish and our joys. By dipping them in myth, we see them more clearly. I do not think he could have done it any other way. This goes back to the metaphor of a lens that we were using for Lewis. What his
Right.
fiction does for us is it holds up a mirror or a lens to see
Hmm.
the world as it actually is. And sometimes you need to see through myth to see the real world for what it actually is.
That's a great point, Cole. It's sometimes in our world, things are so complicated, so familiar that it's hard to see true north. It's hard to figure out who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. When we cast the world into this world of myth, for example, when you read Lord of the Rings, you are a little bit of an outsider and you've changed your lens. And now all of a sudden things become clear. And then when you turn back to the real world, it comes with you. And so you're right that this whole mythic world is a lens that really sharpens our view of our lives.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes you notice things about people, about events. It's trying to get you down into the underlying grain of the
Hmm.
world. And one of the ways that Tolkien does that so well is his portrayal of evil. He's very one thing people have noticed a lot about the Lord of the Rings is how potent the descriptions of evil are. Of course, you have things like orcs that are
Right,
these evil armies, these hordes. They don't care about human life. They're total Philistines in the sense that they don't care about beauty, they don't care about knowledge, they just live for conquest. But then Tom Shippey, in his books on Tolkien, points out that maybe the best picture of evil in The Lord of the Rings is the wraiths, the ring wraiths, who have started out as noble kings, but they've been seduced by
right,
power and importance. And now they're servants of the Dark Lord running across the face of the earth, looking for, lusting after the ring and the power that the ring will bring. And in some ways, they're kind of suspended between life and death. And
right,
this can happen. And in fact, what you see in The Lord of the Rings is a lot of people who are teetering on the edge of becoming a wraith. They're no longer themselves. Gollum is a great picture of this. Gollum is
right.
is someone who's been corrupted by the ring. And this is really essential to Tolkien's worldview, is that yes, it is a fallen world, but it's not an irredeemable world. And so
Right.
what completes this moral picture for me in Tolkien is yes, the universe is fairly clear in terms of good and evil, but the characters are very complicated. So
Hmm.
you don't have that many characters, in fact, maybe very, very few characters who are totally good or totally evil. Instead, you have people that are somewhere in the middle. You have all these
Hmm.
foils. You have Gandalf and you have Saruman. Saruman starts out as powerful and noble and white, and Gandalf is kind of second class JV Gandalf the Grey.
Uh-huh.
But by the end of the Lord of the Rings, they switch places. Saruman has become powerless, and he's squandered his power and influence by selling out to Sauron. And Gandalf has been reborn as Gandalf the White because of his sacrifice and his virtue. You think about Boromir and Faramir, who are
Right.
brothers, but they are foils. Boromir is not totally bad, but he's not totally good. He's conflicted. He wants the ring. He's seduced by the ring. He tries to take the ring, and then he repents and gives his life for the Fellowship. Faramir is counted out. He's the younger son. He's trying to impress his father, who doesn't care for him at all. And in the end, he becomes a noble, courageous leader and ruler next to Aragorn. Um, and he finds true love in the healing place, in the houses of healing. So there's all
Hmm.
these characters who are kind of on this journey. Frodo himself is on this journey. In fact, he's maybe the most complicated character in the entire mythology that Tolkien writes. Of At the one hand, he sets off with great motives. He wants to destroy the ring because he knows it's right. But by being so close to the ring, he too becomes a duplicitous, split character over the course
Hmm.
of the Lord of the Rings. If you were going to kind of plot some of these others on the spectrum that Tolkien is creating, who are the ones that stick out to you?
Oh, they're the characters, you're right. Once you get into it, the characters are very, very rich. The elves probably seem to be the race of people who are the least affected by the ring, but they're also the longest lived. Those who are most mortal are the ones who are somehow seeking an immortality through the ring. And you're right, Cole, the wraiths who are not dead, but they're certainly not alive. They're caught in the middle, and they are the answer. They're the example of what happens when you try to hold on to life at all costs. Probably to me, I think Frodo's complex, but to me, Gollum is probably he's very complex, but he begins as a hobbit, Smeagol the Hobbit, and that character comes out at times. But the ring, has so corrupted him that inside him also lives the Gollum, who is, evil and wants the ring and desires immortality. It's almost like he's a little picture, although he's a grotesque picture of all human beings that desire to fulfill our own desires and then the abhorrence of it. When Smeagol, the character Smeagol, his old person comes out, he's really abhors what he has become, but he completely gets subsumed by the ring. There's a lot of application to human life in there in those characters.
Hmm. The character that probably is the best character in terms of he is good, he's consistently good, is Samwise Gamgee.
Right.
He's foolish at the beginning, but
Hmm.
but he's good. In fact, one of my top three chapters of The Lord of the Rings is right at the very end of the second book. You get the chapter that's called The Decisions of Samwise Gamgee. And he makes some very pivotal decisions, the most significant of which is to relinquish any claim on the ring for himself. He is helping Frodo with his quest. He's not taking over the quest. He doesn't need to be the hero. And I think to loop back to the influence of the Great War on Tolkien, part of what you see in Sam is what Tolkien so admired about the British, these Tommies and doughboys, as
Right.
they're called, going off to fight for England. They're very much
Hmm.
like Sam. They're selfless. They are part of the cause. They're not heroes. They're not remembered. And they're just trying to get back home to marry the girl that they love and have a family. And, Sam
And
at the end, he becomes the
live in the
mayor,
Shire.
and,
Yeah.
and just live in the Shire. That's what they want to do. And he encapsulates that throughout the books. But everybody, even Gandalf or Galadriel, who are really, really good characters, are tempted. And
Right.
they too are liable to the powers of the ring. And so you, and even you look at at the really, really bad characters too, and there's redeeming qualities. As you mentioned with Gollum, we'll come back to this late in the series. This is what Tolkien loved the most, is actually it's Gollum's worst qualities that end up having a benevolent effect on the story in the end.
Powerful lesson there. But before we leave Sam, I will say this. Sam is the only really incorruptible character. And as simple as Sam is, and like you say, as foolish as he is at times, you know what hit me as I read the books? Sam is actually ends up being the hero in that he carries Frodo at the end.
Mm.
He literally carries him up the last part of the mountain without ever wanting the ring for himself. And I do think that is Churchill and Tolkien would both agree that's the best of the British race. You know, that
Hmm.
loyalty and unselfishness is the best of the British race. But I also, as a Christian, can't help interjecting here, just seeing in it the selflessness is what wins out at the end,
Hmm.
and that's a Christian story.
Right. Yeah, there's the question of who's the Christ figure. Is it Frodo? I don't know that there is a Christ figure.
Right.
There are many, many pictures of Christ in the Lord of the Rings. In fact, Phil Ryken has a great book on this where he traces the themes of prophet, priest, and king through the Lord of
Mm.
the Rings. And his argument is essentially in those three roles, you see many Christ figures emerge. Aragorn,
Hmm.
Gandalf, Frodo, several others who are doing some Christ-like things, but aren't necessarily a Christ character. And that actually has a lot more real life to it, even than something like
Right.
what Lewis did in the Chronicles of Narnia, where Aslan clearly is the Christ character in the Chronicles
Hmm.
of Narnia. Instead, in the Lord of the Rings, you don't have any Christ characters. You have some Christ-like scenes and actions that
Right.
these characters do. And that, again, is all part of this myth of helping us to re-see and rediscover our own world, our own reality as it is. But with this mythological lens now, we can see it more real and deeper than we had before.
Hmm.
So this just scratches the surface of the complexity of what Tolkien is trying to do in this myth for England. Of course, it's informed by his deep Catholic faith, his Christian faith. And above all, it's shaped by his experiences as a boy and by the war. What's interesting is after you've got the stage set with these characters, with good and evil, with the background, with all these influences on Tolkien, you can finally begin to understand the central motif, at least in the title of The Lord of the Rings, which is the ring. And I'm excited to talk about this because the quest, which is what we'll cover in the next episode, the quest of the Lord of the Rings is wrapped around the nature of the ring. And I would say one thing I remember you saying, probably the biggest difference between the movies and the book, other than scenes that are left out and plot points and things, but the biggest thematic difference that you don't get in the movies that you get in the book is the will of the ring itself. You can
Hmm.
see it a little bit, but when you read the books, you realize, oh, we've got all these casts of characters, really important characters, but maybe the most important character in the whole thing is the ring. So I want to end with a quote that will set us up for the next time. And this is an early scene in the Fellowship of the Ring when the company of hobbits that have set out have joined up with Strider, who we find out is Aragorn, and they've been attacked by the wraiths at Amon Hen. And Frodo, in response to this, in the panic of the moment, puts the ring on his finger. And Tolkien writes, he heard himself crying out, "Never, never," or was it, "Verily, I come, I come to you." He could not tell. Then, as a flash from some other point of power, there came to his mind another thought. Take it off, fool, take off the ring. The two powers strove in him for a moment, perfectly balanced between their piercing points. He writhed, tormented. Suddenly he was aware of himself again. Frodo, neither the voice nor the eye, free to choose, and with one remaining instant in which to do so, and he took the ring off his finger. We'll pick up there next time on the So We Speak podcast.